again, and welcome to another edition of Mastermind Minutes. My name is Gary Occhiogrosso. I am the founder and managing partner for Franchise Growth Solutions. I'm also the publisher of franchisemoneymaker.com. For those of you who are listening for the very first time to Mastermind Minutes, the concept is pretty simple and easy. We have one guest. We ask one question and we get one expert answer. We typically do it in minutes, not hours, although sometimes they go a little bit longer. This morning, it might go a little bit longer because our guest has a lot to say and a lot that I want to learn. And our guest today is Alicia Miller. She is the founder and managing director of Emergent Growth Advisors, which is a boutique strategic advisory firm working at the intersection of franchising and private equity. She supports founders and franchise management teams facing growth, disruption, or transformational challenges and helps them accelerate their business. She also advises private capital firms pre and post transaction on strategy and value creation initiatives and co-invests alongside with her partners. As a former multi-unit franchisee, which I did not know about you, Alicia, we'll have to talk about that. She brings a franchisee's perspective and operating experience into every engagement that she endeavors. She is a recognized thought leader in franchising and the author of a brand new book called Big Money in Franchising, Scaling Your Enterprise in the Era of Private Equity. And that is going to be the topic of our conversation today, private equity and franchising. But before we go there, Alicia, maybe you give us a little bit more about your background, what you've been doing, and we'll go from there.
Thanks. It's nice to be here. I think the interesting thing is that I've been an operator. I still am in some sense. I'm on the board of one of the large urban air multi-unit franchisees. So I'm still a franchisee, I guess an extension. I also sit on the board of a franchisor that was just acquired by private equity and hasn't been announced yet, but it will be shortly. And I'm an investor in 6 different brands as well as a franchise platform. So I really am walking the walk here. I invest alongside my private equity firms and family offices and work with these management teams to help them either get ready for a sale or, post-transaction, help them sort of lean into the value creation plan that, helps them grow.
Well, that's terrific. And by the way, the fact that you invest side by side, that really is a function of walking the walk. There are a lot of folks on the buy side. I was on the buy side years ago, but I was using other people's money, so it wasn't. I wasn't using my own money. So I would say that is a fantastic approach. So tell us just a general overview about the book. It's not actually available yet, correct? Or it's available pre-order?
Yeah. It's on pre-order right now on Amazon.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think the topic is fascinating. Many years ago, we started talking about this, and years and years ago, I was involved in a concept that did sell to private equity. It was not a successful endeavor, but this was back in, I'm going to tell you, the mid to late 90s. And I'm not sure private equity I think they were just beginning to dip their toe in the franchising waters and didn't really know what to make of it and came in sort of with a banker mentality. And this was, by the way, a restaurant brand. So instead of sort of employing the idea that a restaurant and franchising takes time and it matures and it goes, they came in with the buy it for $2 and sell it 3 weeks later for $5 mentality. And it didn't quite work, but that's another conversation for another day. Tell us how did, and again, as I mentioned, that was kind of like the mid 90s, but how did private equity become such a dominant player in modern franchising here in the US? Because everywhere I turn, we had the CEO of Focus Brands on, which I believe is owned by Rorick Capital. And everywhere I turn, it's private equity in franchise. How did it get?
Yeah, it's true. Institutional capital is now everywhere. It is absolutely a dominant factor in franchising, but it's only a dominant factor in the sense that not every brand will attract private equity money. I think that's that's one thing people need to understand is only the top 14% of brands have attracted private equity money. So if you think about 5,000 active brands, that's about 700 brands that have been touched either at the franchisor level or the franchisee level or both, right? And so that means there's thousands of brands that will never attract private equity interest. Even if they want to work with private equity won't be interested. But private equity has really rewritten the competitive landscape in franchising. They started, as you noted, kind of in the 90s. Franchising for decades was very successful and grew all around the world without private equity's help, right? So, and before private equity itself was even an industry. But in the 90s, they came in and there were some quite large blockbuster deals, a few deals in the late 90s. Some visionary folks were kind of dipping their toe in with franchising, as you indicated. Those folks tended to have a background in retail or malls, so they had some visibility to the franchise model. So there were three big blockbuster deals that Bain did that combined were $5 billion. Burger King, Dunkin', and Domino's, those three. Those large deals attracted a lot of attention to the franchise sector, but they were kind of classic leveraged buyout deals in sort of grand 1990s style. There was a lot of debt on those businesses. And over time, private equity's approach has really changed quite a lot. They're not using nearly as much debt as they used to on these acquisitions. And while they started sort of at the top, in large brands, now the most active players are really kind of working from the ground up. They're doing a lot more with emerging brands and sort of fast growth brands sort of in the middle. And that has rewired competition and made them sort of a dominant quality control force, I guess, if you will. They're selecting some brands, they're putting capital behind them that might be pulling them into a platform and accelerating them, but there's a lot of other brands that are left behind. So this has really reshaped what franchising is and what it will be likely to become.
Yeah, and you mentioned something there that I noticed back in, I'm going to say 2022. I was actually at IFA, and I believe the founder of Unleashed Brands did a main stage speech there that year, and he was talking about how he acquired brands during COVID for the portfolio. And oddly enough, my cell phone went off. I got a text message from a private equity guy that I do business with asking to meet. And we sat down and he started asking me about emerging brands that I had in my portfolio. And I thought this was odd because for years I was getting chased away because they would say, well, we need to have $3 to $5 million EBITDA. Don't call us and we're not interested. And now all of a sudden they were interested in brands that had, I don't know, 10, 20 units, had good upside. And I thought, oh, okay, they must be seeing mature franchisors as competition now. So there were different rules. It wasn't only private equity firms that they were competing with who all had the same sort of rules of engagement. Now they had these franchisors who were scoffing up small brands. So can you talk a little bit about how that shift or why that shift is? Because for years, private equity wouldn't touch anything without what I would consider a good EBITDA line of $3 to $5 million.
Yeah, that's true. And for some firms, that's still true, right? So if you think about sort of all of the franchise brands out there, and then you think about the ones that are not currently affiliated with private equity, which we've already established as, a certain number, the firms will themselves kind of align themselves along the spectrum, right? So there's some that only want to work with emerging brands, some that have a tolerance for emerging brands, but really prefer kind of more established, faster growth with proven concepts, and then some who really only want legacy scale brands. So they will organize themselves this way. They are in some ways forced to look at smaller brands because the space is so picked over. And as you've pointed out, there's plenty of strategic acquirers who are picking up these smaller brands and can nurture them. So they're having to work with smaller brands, and they may prefer. I mean, if you think about the lift that's required in a small brand, to generate enough of a return to make it worth it while for a private equity firm, it's a lot of work. But this is why platforms have sort of exploded across franchising, is it provides that mechanism to pull an emerging brand in and give them the scaffolding or the, the back office support that they need. So they don't have to keep recreating the wheel every time. And of course, there's also usually cross-brand synergies if it's, if they're all chasing the same customers and the same prospective franchisees, there's a lot of value that can be driven there. But the smaller the brand, the more likely they're going to hold that brand longer, because they just need time to be able to really monetize that purchase and grow it to the scale that it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes perfectly good sense. I guess for me, the question that or conversations I've had with some of our clients and other emerging brands, they've asked me, if they're standing in front of private equity or strategic partnership, my response is always pretty clear and pretty much the same, that, hey, metaphorically, anyone can write a check for $1 million. Okay. But what assets are they bringing to the table that will help you grow? And typically, I have found that the strategic partnerships bring a lot of assets with shared infrastructure that can help a brand grow. I'm sure there are private equity firms that, hey, we've got 15 QSRs in our portfolio, we can do the same thing. But I think for the most part, the strategic partnership, to me, for an emerging brand, seems to be have a lot more value. Again, I may be completely wrong. I'm out of my lane here. But I'm curious to know what is it about franchising that private equity just seems to love? I mean, is it the asset light aspect? Is it royalties? All of the above? Help us understand that.
All of the above. Yeah, it's all of the above. It's a CapEx light investment model, right? So all the things that are attractive at the franchisor level, where you've got this dedicated pool of entrepreneurs working hard in their own businesses, and the franchisor is paid on top line revenue. And so once you get it going, once you get to a certain scale, you don't have to, adding another 100 or 200 franchisees does not mean you're adding proportionately a huge team at corporate, especially if you're in a platform, right? So it's a very financially attractive model, and it has very predictable growth patterns, so that you can, once you understand the franchise model, you can keep applying your learnings over and over and over and over. And it's just this continuous flywheel of growth if done correctly. That's why they like it. And they love working with entrepreneurs. I mean, it's kind of the best of both worlds for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could see that. And it's interesting because, you had mentioned different private equity firms that sort of have their own pond that they like to swim in. One that you didn't mention, or maybe you did, and I just didn't understand it. And I know a couple of private equity firms like this. And you mentioned legacy brands. I'm going to go one step further, and I'm going to put a bucket there called heritage brands. So yes, we've got brands on the way up. We've got brands who are here and can go here. We've got legacy brands who are way up here, but we've got heritage brands, which in my opinion are doing this. And maybe they've got a great name and they're from 40 years ago, and the franchisor has totally neglected the brand, and a lot of disgruntled franchisees. And now all of a sudden the franchisor says, well, I've got to get out of this. It's a mess. However, to the general public, there's equity in that brand name. And I've seen private equity firms come in and kind of scoop those up, probably at a bargain price. What are your thoughts on that, on these, quote, I call them heritage brands. I don't want to say beat up brands, but any thoughts on that?
Sure. Another term for those would be a fallen angel, where they're
That's
struggling.
So sweet. I love it.
Yeah. So look, there's a lot of these brands out there. The challenge is that most private equity firms actually don't like turnarounds. Their own investing mandate pushes them to more certain outcomes, right? They want less risk. They want a certain growth path, and they need to be able to show a certain return. Well, turnarounds are messy just in general, right? The turnarounds are
Yeah.
already difficult. But franchisor turnarounds are one of the toughest assignments in business because you have this dynamic of independent franchisees. So the franchisees have to get on board with your turnaround plan, or they'll just sit back and go, "Hey, I'm not expanding until you fix this, this, this." Well, you can't restart growth without your franchisee buy-in. So it's really difficult for some of these legacy heritage brands. Once if you go too many years milking the cash flow and taking cash out of the business at the owner level, and this can happen no matter who the owner is. It could be a publicly traded brand, it could be a privately held non-PE brand, or it could be, it's not a PE issue. It's are you investing in the future of the business issue? Are you keeping the brand fresh? Consumer habits change, demographics change, locations need to be moved and refreshed. And you don't see on top of that, your brand can stall out. And
Yeah.
that's without factoring in something like technology, which everybody is struggling to keep up with. So yeah, these fallen angels are very, very tough to turn around. And private equity money, it depends on market cycles, but generally only 3 to 10% of all private capital funds available for investment are invested in turnarounds. You don't want to land there. You want to do everything possible to avoid becoming tomorrow's turnaround.
Yeah.
No one's gonna show up with a bank truck to help you out. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that makes sense. By the way, internally, I don't know how often it's used in the world of franchising, but internally in our organization, when we come across those brands, we call those brands that have suffered through what we call collect and neglect, where the ZOR is just collecting, kind of harvesting, and not really doing much of anything. So would that then lead someone, me, or a franchise buyer, to believe that if a private equity firm is interested in a franchisor, that it signals that it's a high quality franchise?
That's a great question. I think that would be a dangerous shortcut to take with your money. You need to do a lot of due diligence to figure out what's going on in that brand. It is a signal that the PE firm has a plan to monetize that brand in some way, but their interest in yours may or may not be aligned. So you've got to really do some digging and also kind of understand their track record and what kinds of brands they tend to invest in and what happens with those brands. So all of this can be discovered through some, a little bit of internet research and certainly interviewing franchisees to understand how things have changed. When well done, private equity firms can trade these brands over time, and the brands can continue to grow in a very clear way. Tropical Smoothie Cafe is a great example of this. They've traded a couple of times between private equity firms, and they continue to grow in both units and AUV. And their franchisees keep coming back to buy more units, which is, as that one of the best signals that things are going well is when franchisees come back and say, "Yeah, I want to expand."
Yeah.
So you got to do some digging to understand what's going on.
I understand. I will say this because I love the guy. Tropical Smoothie Cafe has a secret weapon, and it's called Charles Watson.
Charles Watson, yes.
Okay, I mean, he is just. I mean,
he's terrific.
He is just off the charts. So then obviously it impacts the franchisees' due diligence and what questions they should be asking, which makes all the sense in the world. And yes, you're right. When franchisees come back and they're buying more, that is, that to me is the best signal.
That's the best signal.
Yeah. Are there different types of private capital investors, private equity investors involved in franchising? Different sort of companies that maybe have varied portfolios, some that only focus on food, or how does that work?
Sure. Yeah. Private equity, it's kind of a common misunderstanding is that all private equity firms are the same. They're not a homogeneous group at all. There are different check sizes, there are different skill levels, there's a different background in franchising. Some are family offices, some are backed by institutional money. Wealthy individuals are becoming much more of a factor, especially in sort of angel investing stage, than they ever have been before. And we're seeing a lot more even direct institutional investors as well. So some of these big pension funds, for example, are investing directly in franchisors and in large multi-unit franchisees. So that's pretty exciting as well to see that level of interest. So, some will only want to work with emerging brands. Some want restaurants. Some will say no food. Some will do club deals with other firms. Some invest in both equity and debt. Some, only provide equity. Some firms are willing to do minority deals. Others, especially the institutionally backed ones, typically can't. They need to have a majority control of the business. So you have to, when you're thinking about bringing on a capital partner, either as a large multi-unit franchisee or a franchisor, you got to really go back to your why. Why do you want a partner? And that'll help you figure out what kind of partner makes the most sense for you, because there are absolutely big differences between them.
Mm-hmm. What happens when either the franchisor or private equity sort of gets it wrong? It looks like a marriage made in heaven, but it quickly goes to hell. What should franchisors look out for to sort of avoid that?
Yeah, I think you don't have to squint too hard, I don't think, to see common themes when things go south. And the biggest problem is poor execution of the franchise model itself. So it's really not a PE specific issue, except that, frankly, I think they should know better. There's when you come in with an investment thesis that you're trying to grow and expand a brand. I mean, franchising by definition is a growth model, right? The whole purpose of it is to drive scale through all these individual franchisees. So if that's your thesis for getting it started in the first place with this investment, then to not keep your eyes focused on that and execute it well, that's a failure of execution in the investment thesis, I think. Yeah. So things like not investing in the future of the business. Well, okay, if you're going to hold the investment for a long time, okay, maybe, but at some point, most private equity firms actually do need to sell it. So the average hold time is 5.5 years for a PE investment. So you've got to invest at least enough in the future so another buyer will actually be interested in leaning into this, right? So you can get your money out. And I think that's where some of these things don't go well. I think the other thing that tends to not go well is if you're not staying on top of that franchisee relationship and keeping franchisee profitability really front and center to what your management team focuses on every day, that's where things can also go south. And again, that's a franchise model execution problem. Franchises are not evergreen cash machines. You've got to invest in the business. You got to make sure franchisees are happy and satisfied and wanting to grow, and that new franchisees are also attracted to that brand and want in. Otherwise, you're not really executing the franchise model as it was intended.
Yeah, for sure. But sort of the unquantified piece to all of this is culture. How does culture play into this, or alignment of culture? Certain franchisors maintain and really practice a specific mission and culture that may not always align with private equity's goal. How does that work? Because it's sort of like a blended family at times. Like, people have to get used to one another. Talk about culture a little bit and how that impacts the transaction or the success or failure.
Yeah, I think this is where private equity firms in general are most challenged, right? Because culture is traditionally has been a very important part of franchising. Franchisees in some of these brands will talk still decades later about meeting the founder and how they came into the franchise. And they've got really deep relationships amongst themselves and with the franchisor. And that's part of sort of what attracted them to the brand and what keeps them there is they feel like they're part of a family. They're part of something bigger. But as brands start to trade among private equity firms, that can get lost along the way if you're not careful about nurturing and continuing that culture. And those squishy soft skills are not necessarily things that private capital firms are well known for. So it takes a real focused effort on making sure at least the management team is good at that, right? And keeping those relationships going. So normally you'll see in the first private equity transaction, the founder is selling to private equity, and the seller or the founder actually cares about preserving the culture. So normally that first transaction, there is some effort made toward preserving it. And maybe in the second deal as well. But by the time it's traded a couple of times, the founder's usually exited by then. And so there's no sort of cultural center of gravity at that point, managing this thing. And that's where things can start to go in a different direction. And so what ends up happening is you get a franchisee base, some of whom came in when culture was important. And then 5 or 8, 10 years later, a whole new batch of franchisees came in when culture was different or less important. And these two groups don't necessarily see eye to eye, right, about the future of the business. So that's where these, managing the relationship and helping franchisees through, changes in the business have to become much more of a focus. When done well, brands can continue to expand like crazy and, add units around the globe when done correctly. When not enough attention is paid to that, that's when things can start to get a little stale, a little contentious, and it's the human element of franchising gets lost, unfortunately. The other thing about culture, I think, that is a concern of mine actually with private equity is, we've got a lot of emerging brands now that seem to be launching with the direct intention of selling to private equity. Whereas before, people would launch a franchise and they were excited about making their brand national, right? They wanted to build something special. Now people are launching saying, I'm launching this because I'm going to sell to private equity, and they try to do it as fast as humanly possible. Well, it's hard to build a culture that way. So I don't know that model will ultimately be successful. Because if you don't have culture to fall back on, then when things get tough, there's no glue there. So then you start managing things through contracts, and we all know how much fun that is. So
yeah, no, and I mean that was a great answer. By the way, I think that was the longest answer you gave us, which emphasizes the importance of that topic. But it's interesting what you said at the end about companies that are launching with the sole purpose of, exiting. And we get that a lot. We get questions about that from our emerging brands. And what we tell our clients is it's good to keep your eye on private equity for this reason. If at some point it happens, and that's not what you're doing this for. You're doing this to build your company, and if that happens, great. However, you need to mind your business now, meaning make sure you have leases from your franchisees, make sure you're collecting your royalties, make sure because if and when private equity does happen, somebody is showing up and they're ripping through everything because they're looking to create less value, not more. They want to pay less, and they're looking for things. So when the conversation of private equity comes up for our clients with respect to, and their emerging brands, we tell them not what you should be focused on right now, other than the process of maintaining your business in such a way that it will be acceptable to private equity, maybe 10 years from now. We don't know, if at all. So I find that to be, a fascinating piece, along with the cultural mindset of some individuals who think, we have people who they don't even have an operating prototype and they want a franchise. That's another piece of craziness out there. But what do you believe is the future? I'll ask you to take out your crystal ball now for a moment. What do you believe is the future of private equity and franchising overall?
I think the strength of the franchise model is such, and there's always this, new group of franchises coming in every year. Something like 400 new brands launch every year. So it's still going to be a very rich area of private equity interests and investments, so long as the franchise model is attractive. They'll be here to invest because what they do well is accelerate companies, and that's what emerging and growth brands need, is that help and support and strategic thinking, strategic thought partner. I think for me, the future of franchising, though, is being challenged by things like constant threat of, say, joint employer, which is now very much being talked about, which is not a PE issue per se, but the franchise model itself has proven to be very successful for more than a century, creating entrepreneurial opportunities. And we just have this constant like whack-a-mole of folks trying to tear down the franchise model. I think anyone with an interest in franchising needs to be especially aware of what's going on in politics, and needs to get themselves involved through the International Franchise Association to speak to local representatives and so on. It's all of our responsibility to kind of stay on top of that. And the joint employer issue in particular is one that should be really on folks' radar.
Yeah, oh, I agree. The franchise model is being attacked by politicians all over the country, and I don't understand why. We create jobs. We're a large chunk of GDP. It's a great model. It gives individuals, and maybe this is why it's being attacked by politicians, it gives individuals freedom to create their own legacy and create their own equity. And maybe that's what government doesn't like about it. So just for those of you who have just joined us, and you'll probably want to start back at the beginning here, we've been speaking with Alicia Miller, who is the founder and the managing director of Emergent Growth Advisors. The book is Big Money in Franchising, and I love big money in franchising, and essentially how to scale to get to that. Any last thought you'd like to leave us with on this topic of private equity, franchising, growth, scalability, things of that nature?
Sure. I think private equity just needs to be on everybody's radar. This is now a permanent thing, and if it wasn't before, it needs to be. And there are folks like me out there that can help you sort of digest what's going on and figure out what it means to you. So as part of your due diligence process, whether you're on the franchisor side or the franchisee side, or even as a supplier or a consultant working in franchising, you've really got to kind of invest yourself in understanding all of these dynamics, because it will make you a lot smarter and will make you more effective in franchising.
Well, that's great. That's great. Now, again, the book is available for pre-order on Amazon, correct? And
Yes.
if someone wanted to reach you or learn more about what you do, what is the best ways, or a website, or how would someone get in touch with you?
Sure. My email is amiller@emergentgrowthadvisors.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn if you want. And the website is emergentgrowthadvisors.com. You can also look on bigmoneyinfranchising.com, and you'll find me that way as well.
Great. Alicia, this has been absolutely terrific. We have to have you back on. I love talking about this stuff. It's definitely a big piece of our business these days. Again, I can't thank you enough. And I guess I will see you probably at IFA coming up.
You will. Thanks, Gary. It's nice to see you.